I'm going to be talking about the internment camps the Japanese population was put into. Perfectly
With
into.
all that in mind, here's what we did to them. Because of our stupid mistakes, this is how we treated them.
They called the aliens over here. Put them away. This is not so much a forgotten story. This doesn't get talked about a lot. Mm-hmm. There are memorial sites for this and everything. When I was a kid, my dad used to go to Santa Anita a lot, and my mom would nudge me and say, they used to keep a lot of Japanese people here. And I didn't know what that meant. Like, what, like apartments?
She said that everywhere.
We should specify. There's a difference between internment camps and assembly centers.
Okay.
An internment camp. We had an internment camp in Manzanar, California. I didn't do too much research on what they did in internment camps.
That's surprising.
Thanks. Actually, I did read a couple books. I read some oral biographies. I watched about 4 documentaries. And I was able to interview about 6 Japanese detainees for first-hand accounts of their lives. But because it was in Inyo County, Daniel won't let me talk about it. So we're just going to skip all of that.
I don't want to hear what they have to say.
What we had here was assembly centers. And, well, Santa Anita, where the racetracks were, and then they closed it all down to turn into an assembly center. Basically, they rounded everybody up. They put them in barbed wire watch, and then from this point on, they sent them off to Manzanar or New Mexico, like Santa Fe, New Mexico. What they did there, I'm not really sure because it didn't happen around here, so I didn't do research for it. So we had 2 really big ones in our area. Santa Anita was one. It was an assembly center. We also had a detention center up in La Tuna Canyon. I call it the Tuna Can Camp. It was
the Tuna Can.
The Tuna Can. Tuna. Oh,
God,
boy.
This is your McNamara, brother.
This is my McNamara. It was in Tahunga. It's in those hills above Sun Valley, right off the 210. There's now a golf course there, and a housing development is being put up.
Japanese welcome.
First, let's talk about Terminal Island. Do you ever go to Long Beach? Nope. Or San Pedro? Nope. And pass by an industrial wasteland that looks a little bit like the Badlands of Road Warrior. That's Terminal Island. Terminal Island at one point, very early in the 20th century, had a really, really large Japanese population that both created and ran a very industrious fishing village. Like they pretty much, because it was so contained and it was almost all Japanese, the population, I think I read it was like 97% Japanese. They were able to like flourish and create their own village that looked a lot like Japan. There's like pictures of, they call it Furusato, which means home sweet home. It looks a lot like Japan in some areas. Now, we're going to be talking about 2 generations of people. The Issei are the Japanese born people who are immigrants here, and then the Nisei is the second generation American born. That's going to come up a couple times.
Okay. I always get them confused.
Yeah, they look so much alike, the Nisei and the Issei. Anyways, so the port of Terminal Island had been used for importing goods long before the Japanese population settled there. But once they began to establish themselves around 1899, they began operating in isolation, which allowed them independence, like I said. Terminal Islanders developed their own culture. They developed their own dialect, which was sort of like a hybrid, like the Spanglish equivalent
Japanglish?
Japanglish, thank you. So by 1941 there was about 3,000 Issei and Nisei living in the homes in the area.
The age-old story of Issei Nisei.
I knew you were gonna say that. I knew it. I even wrote it down with a response, and I don't know where it is right now. We'll get back to it.
Here it is. Shut up, Daniel.
Shut up, idiot.
It's offensive.
They settled on Terminal Island, which at the time was known as East San Pedro, because Terminal Island is a horrible, scary sounding name for something.
The world wasn't ready.
So their little fishing village was next to Fish Harbor, which is still there. Most of the local residents worked in the fishing industry. If you weren't working on like a boat out and sea getting fish, you probably worked in a cannery or something. It was very like fish oriented, and they like distribute their entire city. Their little village there had a fisherman's hall where they taught like Japanese martial arts, judo and kendo. They had a Shinto shrine. They had little grocery stores with Japanese goods. They had parlors where they made like billboards and stuff. The children attended Walliser Elementary School, and they took the ferry to high school. Imagine that, taking a ferry to high school. It's so hard to ditch once you're on that ferry. At first, Terminal Island was an all-male community, but the number of women and children slowly increased because they finally finished The Lord of the Flies, so they know how it ended. So they invited people, women to come. The women worked in canneries. They had the 2 canneries. They had Southern Fish Company, and they had band camp. December 7th, 1941, a day that lives in infirmary. Pearl Harbor happens. You didn't specify enough. I'm sure people know already. There was a naval base in Hawaii that was attacked by the Japanese.
Wait a minute, that's Pearl Harbor?
That's Pearl Harbor. Oh no.
God, I thought that's where they found all those clams.
Oh God, I said Hurricane Harbor, didn't I? Look at these clams. Pearl Harbor.
Never forget.
Never forget. Hours after the attack, the FBI begins to round up the Issei boat owners and the community leaders of Terminal Island. All fishing operations were shut down. Any boats that were out fishing at the time of the attack were radioed back to shore, where the Coast Guard raided their boats and their homes and just took anything they considered contraband, which could be anything.
Fish.
Yeah. The homes of community leaders were searched and contraband was confiscated. By community leaders, it was everyone from like people who ran organizations to martial arts instructors. Like everybody basically.
Sensei.
They got senseis. And they couldn't defend themselves? I'm not going to take a class with them. Soldiers, heavily armed, rode around in jeeps and patrolled Terminal Island 24 hours of the 24-hour-long day. It became basically, because it was an island, they could pretty much just contain it. Almost immediately, they had cleared out the what was called the CCC camp, which was Latuna Canyon. It was basically set up to help people during the Depression find jobs and work on the land and like get situated so they can go back to work. Roosevelt set that up in the 1933. As soon as Pearl Harbor happens, they clear it out. Like, okay, we're keeping Japanese and Italians and Germans here. So they're detained there, all the males. And this happens almost immediately, like within like a week. 6 days later, Terminal Island was turned into a military area. All civilians were ordered to leave within 48 hours and had to leave almost all their possessions, including fishing boats and fishing gear. Some were able to sell furniture and fishing gear and some of their possessions, but because it was such short notice, they had to sell it for really cheap, so people were just taking advantage of them. The residential Issei and Nisei of Terminal Island had to shack up with relatives or whoever they could in the alley area, but the government decided even that wasn't good enough. So a few months later, they were ordered to internment camps, which is eventually what happens. Most of the Japanese population, some 110,000, were sent to Manzanar, like I said, up north. George Takei's parents were there. I don't know if he was there as well.
He's not old enough, is he?
He is. He was... Okay, Star Trek was the 60s, so he could have been
he could have been a little baby there.
Little baby. 19th of February, 42, Roosevelt signs Executive Order 9066. So the executive order sent 120,000 Japanese Americans to internment camps. 62% were the Nisei and Sansei, which was like the third generation, like grandsons of the Issei. Mm-hmm. So there were camps not only in California, they had some along like the entire west area, like Arizona and Oregon, Washington. They went inland for Arizona. Now Arizona's going to think it's West Coast. It's not. Only there in 42.
Don't get any big heads, Arizona. Just because you detained a few Japanese, you think you're all that?
We held thousands of them.
I've actually heard, this isn't defending what they did, but I've heard that FDR did what he did, ordered what he ordered for their protection.
That could also make sense, too.
It does make sense, but also... No, it doesn't hold up because he didn't want, because people were racist. They're very racist and they're scared and angry, and he didn't want like civilian Japanese and German people to be like lynched in the street.
That makes sense in a nice way, and I hope that a part of the reason they did that was that.
Yeah, I'm sure the Germans felt the same way about the Jews.
Listen, you can't even step on the street right now, all right? We'll take care of you.
Just stay inside. Also, close your businesses. We'll make it easier for you.
Some of the most lavish bunk beds you've ever seen. Just reading about all the hysteria around Pearl Harbor and relating it back to September 11th. Like, oh, yeah, that's right. Like, cab drivers were being pulled out of things and just being beaten in the middle of the street. Yeah. People were like, well, get them. Where are they? Call for a taxi.
Who were their parents?
So part of me is like, okay, well, it's probably, I don't want to say it was better for them, but I'm sure that they dodged one bullet and got hit by another one.
Yeah, I know. Yeah. They dodged a bullet and got punched in the jaw.
While these relocation camps were being built, evacuees were ordered to stay for a few months at assembly centers throughout California, like I said, Arizona, Oregon, Washington. They were looking for locations to detain a large number of these segregated individuals, so they cleared out Santa Anita Racetrack. They got rid of all the little horses, and they shut the park down.
Where did they go?
Hollywood Park. I don't know.
There was a big influx of glue production in Los Angeles during the war.
They sent all the horses to Terminal Island. Latuna Canyon Detention Center had about 7 barracks. It was really small. They kept saying it could only hold 300 persons. But come on, like in times like this, I keep reading like, oh yeah, it had like an inflow of like 1,500 people just moving in at any given time. I don't know if they were there all at the same time, but like it's really hard. Like, okay, 300, now send another 300, and even then, like you're at capacity. The Tuna Can camp, you were there from like a few weeks to about 3 months until they figured out where to send you. Then they put everyone on a train, and you either went to Fort Missoula, Montana, or Fort Lincoln, North Dakota, which was really far. A long train ride.
That's a lot of camps. That's
a lot.
That's ridiculous.
Isn't it ridiculous?
It's
and it went on till like March of the next year. Tuna Can camp, as I disrespectfully call it, included 7 barracks, an infirmary, a mess hall, office buildings,
and a mayonnaise dispenser.
They had a medical care facility, a barbershop, a canteen that sold goods to internees. They had religious services with a Christian priest and a Buddhist priest. They had allowed visitors on, I believe, Sundays. Like, there was like 2 minutes for each person, basically. As bad as it was, they were sort of given a lot of freedoms within these camps. Like the guy who ran, I think, Tuna Can Camp, his name was M.H. Scott. He allowed their own self-governing system, kind of like jails work. You're allowed your own system and culture to fit in. You were allowed to take jobs for different purposes. You got paid, like, I think you got like a severance package where you were paid when you left like $25 or something. Day-to-day complaints were not severe. Like, they didn't have a lot of, like, their complaints were sort of overall encompassing, and then like little things
as
like,
in, why am I in a camp?
But also like, oh, that they have a Korean interpreter saying everything wrong. We're gonna need like little things. Not like that's a little thing.
Yeah, good thing we trusted the Koreans. That worked out well in the next decade. Only half the country.
And then a lot of people also said like, yeah, you took us from our homes, which is an atrocity, but like imagine that like sentence of like, okay, get out of your home and leave all your stuff behind in Terminal Island. We're going to La Tuna Canyon, Sun Valley, with a lot of shade on the edge of Angeles National Forest. You're like, okay, it might be a vacation, probably not. But a lot of people are like, oh, there's a lot of shade, and like this is what nature looks like. We've been over by the harbor this whole time. This is nature. One of the most notable internees at Tuna Can Camp was Toraichi Kono, who was Charlie Chaplin's chauffeur and personal secretary until 1934. He was picked up before and after the attack and was accused of being a spy for the Japanese military. On the second arrest, he was sent to the Tuna Canyon Detention Center on December 19th, which was like, what, a week and some change?
12 days.
Oh, okay, numbers. And from there, he was sent to other horrible places. Recently, with Tuna Can Camp, there's a golf course there, and there's a developer who was going to build houses. And like, okay, well, we also need to put a memorial because something, there was this crime against the Japanese committed, and you need to put up a memorial. And I kept reading reports where the guy was like, nah, I'm not going to do that after like he agreed to. But basically it comes down to him like, yeah, we're going to have it, but like, can you keep it to the side? Like, we don't need it like right up front. Anyways, all operations ended at Tuna Can Camp on October 1st, 1943. So now we're going to go back to the racetrack.
And they all went home.
They all
got to go home? Or?
No. From there, they're sent to other camps. Okay. But operations shut down.
They were done with that.
Yeah, they're
so
done.
Every Japanese person was out of the city by then.
Yeah, basically.
I know that they also, I remember when we were doing the Venice one, they sort of rounded people up in Venice.
Yeah, in Venice,
that's where they would send them.
Yeah.
And then from there to there.
It's PCH will take you very far up north. Tuna Can Camp was sort of short term. After that, some time settles down. It's February. Executive Order 9066 is placed in after this point. They clear out the racetracks, and they're taken to Santa Anita racetrack. It was once home, like I said, to one of the largest assembly centers for Japanese Americans in North America. Assembly centers, not the internment camps. So the entire park was cleared out, and they had a row and row of identical barracks covered with tar paper. They had several mess halls. They had a hospital. They had stores, a post office. They had classrooms. They had a makeshift church in the track's grandstands. Each detainee was given an army bed, one blanket, and a straw mattress. Good stuff. The racetrack was all surrounded, like I said, by barbed wire. Later, this was the model for America's Best Value Inn. A lot of people don't know that. Overall, of course, this is a big issue and it's a problem, and they shouldn't have been there in the first place. But like day to day, it was just like life in an internment camp, basically. It was like life in jail. There wasn't a lot of money for activities, but they found things here and there to keep themselves occupied. They had marble contests, they had dances, community would sing for a concert, they had talent shows.
I think that's the base qualification as occupied.
Yeah.
Those sorts of things.
They had something called the Japanita Jive, which was Santa Anita's first band and orchestra, from which the Starlight Serenaders developed, a 12-piece band led by Larry Kurtz, who was allowed to camp for that purpose twice weekly. Yeah, you import a guy to sing. About half a dozen Boy Scout troops. They had a PTA. The Boy Scouts conducted daily flag raising and lowering ceremonies, which was really nice. We love America. They had a theater group. They had religious services that were still upheld, albeit mostly improvisational, just like, okay, like they had a visiting priest and he would just, okay, well. They also had teacher school, like if they had any teachers that were detained, then they became the teachers inside the camp as well for whatever kids were around. Despite the summer still beating on everybody, sports were played regularly. They had softball, hardball, basketball. They played badminton. They had sumo wrestling. The camp had more than 70 softball teams organized in 3 leagues. They had a female judo team. They had
judo or churro?
Judo. This isn't the plague. It's judo now. By mid-August, the golf driving range had been built. Fever and digestive problems were the most widespread medical conditions due to the unbalanced diet and the unfamiliar heat to them because they were so used to being by the harbor. According to the Army's final report, there were 37 deaths and 197 births. One of these births was actually...
They said barfs.
Barfs.
198.
In one day. Of the births that happened in Santa Anita...
George Takei.
A baby was born named Roy Nakatani. He had a son, Kori Nakatani, who became a horse jockey who commonly races at Santa Anita, and they always want to bring it up. He's like, listen, I don't know. But of course, this was still a detainee camp. At night, searchlights still swept the streets. They still had raids on their stuff. Residents were banned from possessing any literature printed in Japanese. This was considered contraband to them. Now, Santa Anita did have a library, and the library was a cubicle in the grandstand. It had several thousand books on its shelf, 5,000 loan donated from LAPL. I thought you would like to know that.
Good for them.
But the ban on Japanese literature resulted in the room. Sure, whatever. That's why all the Japanese owe fines because of that time. And it carries on. You inherit your grandparents' debt to the library system.
The fines of your father.
But the ban on Japanese literature resulted in the removal of countless books, though. So a lot of books that they wanted to read usually got go. Initially, only magazines were available to the public. But later, people would check out like 4 books a week. And the head librarian was Anna Morikawa. Just in case you want to know.
Okay. I'll ask around.
Thanks.
See if she's still going.
Thanks. Now, visitors could be received at the Baldwin Avenue gate. Due to the great number of visitors, visiting was really restricted, and only direct relatives and business representatives were allowed to apply for a visitor's pass. This was between 2 hours, 2 to 4, and they commonly saw more than 1,000 people at a time trying to visit people. And again, I believe it was like 2 minutes at a time. Santa Anita was the only WCCA, which stands for the Wartime Civil American Control Administration, one of the only camps that had any kind of disturbance of a serious proportions occurred. On August 4th, there was a dispute between the detainees and the detainers. A routine search for contraband and announced confiscation of hot plates, and a hot plate turned really violent. There was a lot of rumors and complaints spread as the crowds gathered. Apparently, they thought that one of the people was like an informing against them, like Stalag 17. I guess they beat him up. 200 military police were called, and then about 2,000 people were protesting. I can't tell. It just says an informant was beat, so I don't know if he was informing on the Japanese or they caught him as an informant for the Japanese. But one guy got beat up for being an informant. So they got locked down basically because of that. Everyone's privileges were locked down at that point. Once the soldiers entered the camp, the crowds dispersed really quickly and martial law was declared that night, and residents were confined to their barracks with no meals served. The military police patrolled inside the center for 3 days, withdrawing from the camp on August 7th. It was only one instance in which they declared martial law, and that was it basically. So there wasn't a lot of like what's the word? The pirate word? There wasn't a lot of mutiny.
Booty? Oh.
Booty. There wasn't a lot of booty.
Yeah, mutiny.
Yeah, there wasn't a lot of mutiny.
A lot of booty.
Let's talk about the Pacemaker a little bit. The Pacemaker was a magazine that they put out, a newspaper that the Japanese put out within Santa Anita. And it's available on the Arcadia Public Library website. It's all free. It's all very entertaining. It was written in English by a staff of Japanese Americans interned at the camp. It came out twice a week on about like 4 to 6 mimeograph pages. They found enough wiggle room to like put their own creative stamp on the publication. It was really neat. A typical issue reported official announcements such as ordering evacuees to return their plates and utensils to the mess hall, or else the barracks would get searched. They also reported news like births and birthday parties and club meetings and any kind of sports reports. They ran a women's column called Feminine Forum, in which the writer dispensed advice about how to wash your hair when shampoo wasn't available, stuff like that. They were in jail. They don't. Just why bother? Horse manure.
There's plenty of it. We left it all for you.
They managed to slip in some subversive humor from what I read. When it profiled the Japanese American family from Arcadia interned at the camp, the tongue-in-cheek headline read, "Well, it wasn't much of a move." I thought that was pretty funny. It was popular enough, and it's such an artifact from that time that it gets revered. So on August 26th, the evacuation of Santa Anita began. About 900 detainees were sent out either by train or by bus. That was for long-term confinement. Some were sent up the Colorado River. Some were sent to Wyoming, Manzanar, like I said, central Utah, Grenada, Jerome. They were sort of just dispersed everywhere. I don't know how that works. After the closing of the Assembly Center, the site became Camp Santa Anita, a training facility for 20,000 Army troops. It was the largest Army Ordnance training center on the West Coast, and more than 100,000 soldiers were trained here until like November of '44.
Was this like the only place in LA at the time? Like
everything else was they were having dance marathons at. They couldn't square
horse
off.
track / multi-purpose military site.
If you look at the lot, it's flat, it's giant. And it's because it's flat, it can be easily contained. Like you can't do that at Dodger Stadium because there's so many hills. It's so close to the river. It's so close to train
Dodger
tracks.
Stadium didn't exist.
It's also because it was Chavez Ravine.
We would have used Dodger Stadium, but it's in Brooklyn.
In January of '44, the Supreme Court ruling halted the detention of U.S. citizens without cause. An exclusion order was rescinded. The Japanese Americans began to leave all the camps they were at, most returning home to rebuild their former lives, which they couldn't. The last camp closed in '46, and by the end of the 20th century, the U.S. government had paid $1.6 $6 billion in reparations to the detainees and their descendants, which is really good. The internees were released with $25 and a ticket home. They returned home to find nothing. Furusato, where they lived, the fishing village, was gone without a trace. Everything got bulldozed, basically. Like
racehorses
lived there. They were being killed there. The canneries were still operating, and a few people went back to work there. It was a loss of $130 million that they had created from the fishing village. Everything was completely destroyed. All the fishing boats were either taken by the military, repossessed, stolen, or destroyed. In 45, San Antonio Park reopens as a park, and it becomes like the world premiere place to watch racehorses, basically. In 71, former residents of Terminal Island created the Terminal Islanders Club. They meet every once in a while. They have reunions and they have golf games and picnics and stuff. Most of them are in their 80s now. I think it was in 2001 where the Santa Anita Racetrack designated their spot as a California historic landmark. In 2000, it was included as one of the National Trust for Historic Preservations of the most endangered sites because of everything that happened. So it's listed. If you go there, it does mention a plaque like right before you go through the gate. It's like, oh, hey, by the way,